probably the only challenge that I am facing as a mom, and that my family is facing is that of prejudice. If there wasn't prejudice in the world, actually, we wouldn't even be having these series. There wouldn't be any issues for queer families and queer people at all. And this has been part of a larger question that I've been asking also within my work. So I've also at the moment enrolled for a master's in health professional education. So that's about training doctors and training medical students. And I've already had a question for many years in how do we create a patient-centered doctor? And the reality is every single human being, no matter where you're from and no matter what your background is, we all have our little prejudices and those little things that we have issues with. And of course, when you're looking after patients as a doctor, you can't bring any of those issues into the consulting room. To provide really good care, you have to be able to be affirming for every single patient that comes through the door. And yet a lot of people come already with all kinds of perceptions from their own backgrounds, their own cultures, their own religions. And so I've become really interested, and especially more so in the last 3 years, of how do we educate for that? How do we work with prejudice? And so I've been studying prejudice. And so I'm going to ask, I've already given myself permission to start off with a little academic presentation to start the conversation off, of what I have found and come to understand about prejudice, and a little bit understanding the science behind what happens when we meet prejudice. And I have found this science really helpful, both in my own education, being able to educate others, being able to really reflect on my own prejudices, which is probably against Christian people, which I'm working on very strongly, and all those own specific little things that we meet every single day, whether it's on social media or in the workplace, and how to better be able to manage those scenarios. There's no magic wands, I'm afraid, but understanding is always a good first step. And the thing, this is what I teach in a lot of my modules around patient care, is that we as human beings sometimes forget that we actually have two different modes in which we operate. And these are physiological modes. They are determined by the hormones and the endocrines in our bodies. And those two modes I'm going to be calling survival mode. And when we're in survival mode is anytime when you're saying you're stressed or you're feeling anxious or you're feeling fearful, your adrenaline levels go up. And we have a certain part of the brain that gets activated called the limbic brain. It's the primitive part of the brain. We also share it with the animal kingdom. And in medicine, we call that the sympathetic nervous system is in charge. And it literally changes your whole body. When you don't have adrenaline in your system, then we are what we call in creative mode. Now the prefrontal cortex comes into predominance, and we call this the parasympathetic nervous system is now in charge, and the body changes is completely different again. So I think most of us know about the body changes, right? So when you're in survival mode, your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up, your breathing goes up, all the blood goes away from your digestive system, so you get really all that fluttery feeling on your stomach. And when you're in creative mode, your muscles relax, your blood pressure goes down, your heart rate goes down, and et cetera, et cetera. What we forget is that these changes also changes the way we think and the way we behave. And we don't have much control over that because our bodies are in these different modes. And there's a switch. And the switch, of course, is adrenaline. So if you've got adrenaline in the body, you will be operating out of your limbic brain. If you don't have adrenaline, you can operate out of your prefrontal cortex. And the thing that triggers that adrenaline has always got to do with safety. And this safety happens on 3 different levels. So we need to feel safe physically. So bodily, we need to feel that we're not under any threat or going to be hurt in any way. We need to feel safe emotionally. So we need to feel loved and looked after and be part of something. And we need to be able to express who we are, whether it is choosing our career, choosing what we want to wear, choosing or being able to identify with whatever gender or sexual orientation that we are. So these things are, we want to be able to live an authentic life and be able to live the lives that we choose. And when we are feeling threatened on any of those levels, physically, emotionally, or being able to express ourselves, the adrenaline goes up and we are more in a survival brain mode. And this changes the way we think. And I'm going to concentrate a little bit on this thinking and behavior because this is where the crunch of the matter lies. So it looks a little bit busy and it's going to get even busier, but I'll talk us through this slide here. So on the left-hand side here, we have the survival brain mode, and that is when The survival brain is in action, and the purpose of the survival brain is obviously survival. It's been with us for thousands of years. And when we're in survival brain mode, it's all about surviving the moment. So I like to call this street view. So on the left here, you can see, like in video games, when you're down in the streets and you can only see really what's happening right in front of you, and all of your focus is just about staying safe. So when we're in street view mode, or when we're on that survival mode, we basically have three things that's really important. We want to avoid any pain, so our fight-flight system kicks into play. And we want to seek things that is pleasurable. So these are all sort of survival mechanisms that's built into us. And the five things that sort of our five pleasure drives are, obviously we need food, sex or intimacy. We need power, so ability to, when we have more power, we feel safer. We need a troop, so a group of those around us that we can keep safe in, and security. And you can see we share this with the animal kingdom. The third aspect is energy preservation. So if you think about animals, their whole lives are either about avoiding pain or seeking pleasure or lying down. And energy preservation is the classic, we've all had that I don't really feel like it, or that I can't be asked part of our systems. And it is possible that if you look at us as a society, that in large parts of society's functioning, we actually still function on street view. So if you were to look at for example, the Ukraine war at the moment, that's very much all happening from this particular view of the world. So when we are in street view, our thinking changes, and we want a thinking that is fast and that can help us get out of a fix quickly. So I'll recommend this book for those of you that want details, a very nice thick book written by Daniel Kahneman. He's an economist that actually won a Nobel Prize for his work on behavior. And he talks about fast and slow thinking. And this fast thinking helps us when we're in a fix. So it makes assumptions, it jumps to conclusions, and it's when you have to think really, really quickly. It's very unstable and it's very inconsistent because it depends a little bit on what's happening in your life at that particular moment in time and how you're feeling about things. So from one day to the next, it might change. And this kind of thinking is both very powerful. It's our go-to kind of thinking, but it's not the brightest part of ourselves. So when you have very intelligent people doing very stupid things, think of most sitcoms that we watch, that's usually because we're in survival mode. And the lovely analogy I would like to use is that we can think of this part of ourselves as our inner dragon. And that includes our whole body, our whole endocrinological system, and this limbic brain. And when we're in dragon mode, we have our dopamine reward system sits within the dragon mode, and we are very much self-focused because it's all about survival. We can be both proud and insecure all at the same time. Think of your average adolescent. And we have a little bit of a paranoid, vigilant look at the world because we're always looking for what might threaten us, what might be dangerous. And if you look at the world of social media, one of the powerful things we experience about people when they're in survival mode is this extraordinary emotive judgment. So very much a black and white thinking that just looks and makes things either wrong or things are right, and quite often will express strong opinions, even if it's something that someone doesn't even know very much about. So in my department looks after accident and emergency and our gender-based violence at Tutuzela Center. And on the weekends, when we see a lot of the violence that happens in our local area, all of that has to do, all that aggression, all that danger has to do with people who were in survival mode at that time. But all of us as human beings also have the potential, when we're not in survival mode, to access this higher prefrontal cortex. And when you're able to access that kind of thinking, we are in balcony view. You literally, it's like you're sitting on the top of that balcony and you can look out over the city and you can see what's going to happen in the future, what's happened in the past. And now we're able to access those qualities that we as human beings really value, like being clear and being able to be honest. That's where our conscience lies. That's where we're able to have self-control and delay gratification. That's where we're able to be tolerant and flexible. And this kind of thinking needs much more effort and attention and focus, and we literally burn more sugar, which is why we don't go to this kind of thinking first, because it takes effort to think something through properly. But now you can actually interpret information from lots of different perspectives. And this is therefore much slower kind of a thinking, but this is where we are at our most intelligent. And so we can think of this, if you think you have this dragon part of yourself, you have this prefrontal cortex that should be the master of that dragon and should be the one that takes control of what's happening in our lives. And so this master is able to be empathic and compassionate. Our prefrontal cortex gives us the possibility to step into somebody else's shoes. It gives us the possibility to be generous and humble and realize not only my ideas might be the right ideas. It gives us the possibility to be creative and innovative. All the best things you've done in your life, you've done in this mode. And this is a saying from Brene Brown, which I really love. And imagine we had this on social media, being generous in our assumptions of other people. And whenever we are healing and loving, this is when we are our best as a parent, as a partner, as a team member, is when we are in this particular mode. And remember, this is physiologically determined. So if we look at this in a little bit more detail, just looking at this dragon does not like to be anxious. And so it finds ways to try and reduce this anxiety. So when the adrenaline is up, there are 3 evolutionary mechanisms that we use to try and make ourselves feel better. And that is we fight, we freeze, or we flee. Now, these mechanisms and these lovely drawings have been done by my eldest, who has a knack for art. So they've been drawing me dragons. And when you're on scenarios, and you can see in all 3 of these scenarios, the dragon is not quite under control there. And all of these mechanisms are quite useful when you're under physical threat. So imagine you're a young child and your father comes home drunk and you are terrified and you run and you go and hide under the bed. That's probably very sensible in a physical threat. But when you now grow up and you are in a complicated relationship argument with your partner or with your child, and you go run off and hide under the bed, that might not be the best way to manage this. So Shujaat Chamin, that's the book I've got in the top corner there, he calls these saboteurs. And if you go look up his book, and if you go look up his website, he's got a saboteur self-assessment where you can look up your own saboteurs. And I'm going to quickly tell you about them, and we're going to look at how that affects prejudice. So what I want you to imagine is that most people, when they meet a scenario that's new or meet somebody or something that's different or something they don't understand or know much about, their anxiety levels increase a little bit. And in that scenario, they have adrenaline that's running and they're in survival mode. And when we're in survival mode, we can have different ways to make us feel better and make us feel a little bit in control. And the classic one, which we all do, is we criticize, right? So we're feeling a little bit anxious and we criticize. We criticize the other person, we criticize ourselves. I work for the government, so we criticize the government, we criticize Eskom. And although there's nothing wrong with criticizing as such, if you're in certain scenarios, so you're trying to resolve a difficult relationship issue or you're having an argument with your child, at that stage, getting critical of the other person usually makes things worse, which is why we call them saboteurs. And this is a classic prejudice mechanism. So people feel anxious on social media. They see you post like a lovely, happy Pride Month, and you suddenly get all this extraordinary hate that comes out, criticizing all kinds of random things, and being able to understand, okay, I'm dealing with somebody's dragon here, and it's actually got nothing to do with me at the moment. It has to do with their own stuff. Another classic one is the overanalyzing. So you have probably, yesterday posted some advocacy stuff I'll tell you about later, and got long essays, all of which I deleted, on my WhatsApp regarding God's opinion on my gay kids. And I've therefore, you can see this need to have long lectures and long explanations. And if you do engage in those conversations, you will find most of it is not very evidence-based. It's not necessarily based on logic. It's not actually listening to what you are saying. And it's all this need to control anxiety on the other side. And then the other one is trying to actually manipulate other people when we feel anxious. Those of us that are super organized moms, we all have a little bit of that when we get anxious, the Excel mothers amongst us. But in the world of one of the dangers of this is we, for example, see conversion therapies. So you will actually have both within the world of church, but also even some psychologists who would try and convert people, queer people. And there is even now the American Association of Psychologists, for example, has actually put a warning out for psychologists that conversion therapy we know does not work, and it actually has a very high risk of suicide. So as an American psychologist, if you did conversion therapy, you would actually be scrapped from the psychology board. And we more and more in a process of making conversion therapy illegal because it's something that does harm. And you can see this is people trying to manipulate and organize the world around them. So all queer phobia, most what we call classic homophobia, transphobia, with people getting aggressive and manipulative, usually falls under this particular mechanisms of dealing with anxiety. The freeze mechanisms are not usually quite as violent. The classic kind is people who are pleasers. So you get some people who will have their own thoughts, but will try and be nice in the moment, which is at least more pleasant to experience, but they don't actually express their own questions or their own thoughts about what's going on. You get people who become over perfectionistic. Those are the people who can't turn in their projects until they're perfect. And then a classic thing that we see quite often is all those people with concerns. Now they just have some concerns and vast amount of worries that created. And I think we all have that also as a common way to deal with anxiety. We start lying awake 3 o'clock at the night, coming up with all kinds of things we worry about that we can do nothing about. And for me, this, I like to call this queer tolerance. So these are people are not outwardly aggressive necessarily. They're not outwardly nasty, but they have all these concerns, and it presents in different ways of not feeling very affirming when you interact with them. And then the third sets of mechanisms is those who flee when they're feeling anxious. So these are people who are classically avoiding scenarios. By the way, the little things in brackets underneath are actually the strengths that we draw on when we are creating these little saboteurs. There are those who just feel very sorry for ourselves when we are feeling anxious. And then the classic thing, we all do this, is by distracting ourselves with social media, or with drugs or alcohol or cigarettes, or finding ways of dealing with anxiety. And all of substance abuse's seeds quite often lies within this particular mechanism. Within the world of prejudice, we do find children, for example, who come out, and you have a parent who just goes into denial. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to engage with it. They might even tell the child that they're not allowed to talk about it, that it's not actually happening. And denial is a mechanism of trying to deal with their anxiety. And so there's an avoidance of being able to actually deal with the issues. And you can see all of these mechanisms are mechanisms that people use to deal with anxiety, but they always make scenarios worse. The goal we have as human beings, as we grow older and develop, is to actually integrate the master and dragon. And I love this sketch from my child, because you can see that it doesn't mean that that's always a very smooth process, but at least it needs to feel that the two are working together, and that you have some sort of control in terms of where this dragon is going. And when we're able to do that, we become human beings that are coherent, energized, adaptive, flexible, and stable. And this gives us the possibility to become the affirming parents and partners and community members that we want to be. And I think for me, as a vision of the future, this is where we want to go as a society, as people who build societies built on masters controlling the dragons rather than the dragons causing havoc, as we are seeing quite a lot in the world at the moment. So I always like, when I speak to adolescents about that, I do quite a lot of teaching as well within schools, both teachers and parents, and I've done quite a bit with teenagers over the years. I love the analogy of the How to Train Your Dragon. There's some lovely books called How to Train Your Dragon, and being able to understand how this prefrontal cortex develops over time. So when we talk about gender identity, or when we talk about understanding what your own sexual orientation is, that's a function of our prefrontal cortex. So if you think of animals, they also have a survival system, and they will have certain drives, but they don't reflect on their drives. They simply do. It's only as human beings that we can reflect and think, well, who am I as a person, and what am I attracted to, and what do I like and what do I not like, and why does society think that's a bad thing? So all of those reflections happens from the prefrontal cortex. So up until the age of 3, neither the survival brain or the prefrontal cortex are very well developed at all. We sort of have like a reptilian brain that just functions on I'm hungry, I'm cold, and we have very little consciousness. And then between 2 or 3, the child starts developing a sense of basic self, and that's the survival brain coming into play. And they're starting to be able to say I, and they're able to say no very strongly. And then, oh, look, my child is now awake. And that survival brain is now like a little apprentice baby dragon that will be training over the next 12 to 14 years. The prefrontal cortex only comes online at about the age of 9. So between, sometimes you'll see it 7, 8, 9, 9, 10, sometimes as late as 10. And quite often when we look back in our biography, we'll be able to have a memory of, that's the first time where I really started thinking about myself as an I, who am I, and why is my name that name, and are these really my parents? And where you start thinking about death, and when people start developing fears because they're now able to reflect on what they are experiencing. And so we see a lot of people some people having their first awareness of gender and sexual identity as early as the ages of 7, 8, or 9, as this prefrontal cortex come into play. By the time we're 12, 14, our endocrine hormones, our sex hormones come into play, puberty starts. And at this point, the dragon is fully developed. So by the time you're 13, 14, when your puberty starts, you have a fully functional survival brain. It's there, the whole bang shoot. But you also do have a little master, and the master is still an apprentice phase. So there's a bit of a fallacy that our prefrontal cortex only kicks in by the time we're 21, 22, 23. But that's actually the time when the development of the prefrontal cortex comes to a full maturation. But between 14 and 21, we have the ability to train that apprentice. So every single time we reflect on who we are and what we believe matters, we have this possibility of developing the neural networks of that prefrontal cortex. And so we can see that children who during this age have to reflect a lot about who am I, and what is my identity, and why do I feel like, and why is this different than other people, and why is society like this? And there's an extraordinary, lovely concept, which I've taken from the gender affirming healthcare guidelines, called transgiftedness. And I think it actually applies to large parts of our queer communities and any marginalized population when we talk about intersectionality. If you grow up and you really have to reflect and really have to work on mastering this dragon, because we live in a world that makes us feel really unsafe. And so we have to build extra skills during this ages between 14 and 21. And so we quite often see within the queer communities a very high level of resilience and self-awareness, and a much better ableness to have unique perspectives and to have empathy and insights. I think the world would be a little bit better off if they were ruled by queer communities. So that's just a scientific opinion to explain the advancement of our people. So I'm going to just have a last few slides about a couple of things that I've really found useful for me as a parent. And it's 3 A's: affirmation, how we are allies for our children, and advocacy. And with affirmation, we classically talk about gender affirmation, which has been shown to be one of the most powerful ways to actually affirm our transgender children, to help our transgender children thrive. But for me, affirmation is such a great word. And actually, isn't that what we need as human beings? Every single one of us needs to be affirmed for who we are and how we present in the world, no matter what dimension we are looking at. And we want to build communities where we affirm each other and where we build affirming communities around us. And our first role as a parent is to affirm our child and to help the world around affirm our child. So the Clinician Society guideline talks about 4 domains, and I've broadened them a little bit to look within the whole of the LGBTQIA+ communities. Because there's different ways in how we can affirm people. So firstly, of course, using the true name, using the pronouns, and allowing whatever gender expression or whatever expression we want to have as human beings, and affirming people for that. I see you and you are great just as you are. So for example, helping our kids with pronoun badges and pronoun pins, being able to do all the negotiation with the various family members that need to be talked to, friends, etc., etc. And as a parent, we sometimes have to help take that in-between role to help smooth the way for our children. Psychologically, quite often we want to be able to create this authentic identity, and it's difficult in a world which is not always affirming. So having access to counseling and to affirming counseling. And again, as a parent, you've got to find the right psychologist. You've got to find the person who's going to be on your child's side. Medically, we don't always think about that, but as a parent, it's quite important to make sure your child have access to healthcare professionals that's sensitive to the kind of sexual health needs and conversations that they're going to need to have. And that means calling ahead to your general and trying to find general practitioners that is able to actually provide appropriate care for your child and be affirming for your child, no matter how they present. And of course, for transgender children, and particularly in accessing hormone therapy and gender affirming surgery. So PATH SA, the Professional Association of Transgender Health, that's a great website to find professionals, healthcare professionals that are affirming. And a lot of this can be done online. It doesn't necessarily have to be face-to-face. And then legally, we are extraordinarily fortunate in South Africa that we were actually the first country ever that had sexual orientation specifically mentioned in our constitution as a constitutional right for protection. And gender identity is now also specifically included under our constitutional protection rights in South Africa. And there's still lots of countries, as we know, in the world where very different narratives are playing out. And then, of course, with transgender children, as a parent, one quite often has quite hard work in terms of all the legal name changes and being able to negotiate with Home Affairs and figuring out all the processes for that. So in terms of advocacy, last few slides, this is not for everybody, but I found as a parent, I got pulled into this. So there's the allyship where you help negotiate your child through the different things you need to help them with in the world we live in. But how do we shift community? How do we create communities? How do we change these narratives? And advocacy in East London, we discovered that East London had nothing in terms of support for queer communities. And so my eldest child and I, how many minutes, Naledi? Oh, I've got 10. Okay, don't worry, I'm going to be quicker than that. Great. So when we talk about fostering inclusive communities, we decided to create our own community-based organization. And I think this was actually quite easy to do. So this is my eldest child and I just put together a plan. We got together we invited people who were keen to join us, and we put together a little startup group. I'm not even going to call it a committee because we don't have any we don't have a bank account. There's no financial money that changes hands anywhere. We literally run off a Facebook group. And we've been doing different things through it. So you can see there's all the various events that we've been running. We've had a movie night, which was great. And just creating events where people can feel safe and where we can meet other families, and particularly in our setting, it ended up being quite a lot of families. So it's open to both gay and straight. And it gave us the opportunity to create a little community within East London that then gives us the possibility to advocate for different rights. So, for example, I did some talks as well on a little webinar on how navigating gender identity. There's the QR code at the bottom there. So that's about if you've got family members or friends that you want to send a little webinar on helping them understand better transgender identities and gender diverse people. So this is an example of our latest campaign. So my family and I have just been on a holiday in the UK. My eldest child is on a gap year there. And we were walking down Bromley, that's in southeast London, and we had we noticed that because it's Pride Month at the moment, which is very much celebrated overseas, we even got to join the Rome Pride March, which was very exciting. But we noticed quite a lot of the shops, not all of them, but has some sort of support for Pride going on. And this poster on the right here is one that I got inspired from the Oxfam poster that we've adjusted. And so we decided I noticed as we walked down the road that for us as a family and for my children, every time you see one of these posters or you see a flag, something in you slightly lifts. There's a little feeling of a bit of hope and a bit of feeling of, I don't know, joy that counters sometimes all these negative stuff that gets spouted on social media. So we've come back and we've decided to have our own campaign in East London, and I'm happy for this to go anywhere. So that QR code there will take you to a Google folder where one can download posters, artwork, one can put one's own logos on it. And literally this is for, the tea room at your work, the waiting room at your healthcare facility, the schools, businesses, shops. And we're quite interested to see who's going to support us and put this up. And even if a mall has one or two posters up in one or two shops, every single day, there's going to be somebody's going to walk past that shop and have that little spark of joy. So what happens, of course, you put all of this out there, put it all out in my WhatsApp groups, put it all out. And then there's always this weird pushback. You watch the dragons come into play. And I still find it hard. There's something... You get all the positive interactions, and then there's something quite difficult about watching people having to have all this hate, all this anger, all their fears just being splurged out on social media. And yes, so last night I was dealing with all these essays on why this is all so terribly evil. And how we've tried to counter that is for me, the countering of it is we need to always bring this balcony view. Trying to react through your own dragons, through trying tit for tat, trying to engage with the arguments, there's no point. You can't fight. When you fight a dragon, you always lose. And so us bringing always this message of inclusivity, always a message of love, always a message of diversity. And so we've actually, as GSA, has created a credo to try and counter all these other, can you say, statements or credos of where they think, what they think the world looks like. And for me, we're trying to create a new credo. This is what we think the world should be like. And that no matter who you are, that there should be a place for us within a safe community. So as a little bit, because of this pushback, my last slide is just going to be about looking after yourself. So this is my specific message for parents out there. There are amazing parent support groups. I see there's another one group that support link that's just being sent around on our groups. The group on the left here is a WhatsApp group that's run by Reverend Chris McLachlan, extraordinary psychologist and reverend, this is particularly for parents of trans and gender diverse children. And then Matimba on the right there is actually a group that meets both face-to-face and online in Johannesburg. And there's actually lots of different amazing groups available. And that's been a real lifesaver. So on the WhatsApp group, we will have long discussions about, they're mostly based in Cape Town, but still, home affairs and processes and what you need to have to take with you and which doctors are affirming and which doctors aren't, and, issues with the hormone therapy or challenges that they have been facing with family and friends, and being able to just have other families that affirm your family has been an absolute lifesaver in this. One has this experience of suddenly your community feeling initially that it grows smaller, and we need to be able to find those people that are actually there for us. So thank you very much. We're going to go into conversation after I'm going to hand over to Landa now. That will be Landa's story for me. I've read his book. His book is amazing. Can I please punt it here? And for me, his story is a story of how he calls it becoming a man, and just get me the title right when you speak, Landa. But for me, it's this beautiful picture of this development of this master and seeing this balcony view and this highly extraordinary human being developing through this dragon that had to go through some really difficult times. So I'm really very happy to be handing over them to him. There's any of my details if any of you need to contact me or would like to have any of my materials or would like to join any of our groups or would like me to come and teach anywhere online or whatever. I'm very happy to be involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madeline. That was actually so comprehensive, so intimate. And I was busy here with my phone, like, ooh, I mustn't miss that QR code. So definitely we'll be sharing as much as you're willing to share with us when we do the event reports, which goes up on our website, not a week later after all of it. So thank you so much. That was actually so, I don't know, the English is failing me, but juicy, and I can't wait to engage a bit later. And just a note for the participants, the chat box is disabled, but the Q&A option is open. You can ask an open-ended question in there throughout the conversation, or you can also just drop a comment as there. So instead of the chat function, please use the Q&A function, and then I'll just tally those with my colleagues, and we'll sort of prompt the conversation after Landa has shared later on. Landa, if you don't mind starting, and I'll pop my face again when it's time. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Naledi. I think Naledi is such a vibe. Thank you, Dr. Miller. That was very insightful, much needed. Big shout out to a very good friend of mine who I saw is attending as well, Pierre from UP. Thank you for everyone who's put this together, for the invitation and the opportunity for me to share my narrative. I am going to share briefly about my experiences of being parented as someone who was developing, evolving, growing in various sort of spaces, particularly in what I call dogmatic homes and communities, and how I had to navigate the landscapes I found myself in on the home level, and also talk briefly about my journey as a Black transgender man, but also the probably what I can call the struggles, the sort of complexities that I carry as someone who may or may not become a parent myself. Okay, jumping right in, I was born in 1981. And I was born into dogmatic homes, like I say, where there was a clear narrative, a script, which I call the biblical and theological normative, where there was a belief-centered belief, an absolutist view of what a human being looks like, how they're going to evolve. There were two markers at the time for anyone who was born, pretty much still happens now, the blue or the pink. It's either you're a blue or you're a pink, and there's a specific sort of characteristics that marry a blue and specific characteristics that marry a pink, and the path to evolution is very clear. Very sort of limited, I feel, because it erases a lot of diverse beings who may or may not have clear sort of characteristics defining biological features at birth that do not marry what a blue or a pink looks like. And for those of you who may not sort of quite get my coding, I like colors, but a blue is a boy, a male, and they will grow up to be a husband, a father. They've got clear sort of natal sex, biological sex characteristics, and same thing with a pink. A girl child who will grow up to wear dresses, will probably marry a blue, and at some point will become a mother, and. So in my case, the script I was born into was a pink script, born into very religious families. My parents gave me to my grandparents, my maternal grandparents at 2 days old. And even in that space, I found it to be very restricting, even as I got to start thinking and owning myself as a young child, which for me happened around the age of 7, when I felt that there was somewhat of a disconnect between this narrative, the script that I'm born into, the expectations that marry that, and who I am becoming. At the time, I didn't have a language. I didn't have an understanding. The only thing that I had at my disposal were the people that were charged with my upbringing, which I felt, and in hindsight realize, sort of limited me to what is the physical element or the natal part of who I am. So in other words, the other aspects of my humanness was silenced. The fact that I was developing emotionally, socially, spiritually, intellectually, that was all silenced, or it had to be forced to marry the physical, which was then mapped onto a pink script. And so outside this, I could not assert, I could not determine myself. And I found that I had to relate to my grandparents in Umtata based on what they expected of me. I had to then relate to my parents when I moved to stay with them in Gqeberha, formerly Port Elizabeth, in terms of what they expected or what they wanted, or what they dictated of me. And what I realized early on, even as a child back then, is that with my grandparents, I could push back a bit. So even though I didn't have the language, I didn't have the full scope of comprehension, I didn't understand what was happening with me, but I could find pockets of reprieve with them. They were older, were probably in their reflective years, but even that had to happen within sort of carefully constructed pockets of safety. So on the home level, I could, for an example, dress and express myself how I felt, which was for the most part in shorts. But when it came to the church or when I had to go to school, it was clearly the pink dress code. We could not find wiggle room there. It was not going to happen. And when I got to my parents, though, there was not even an opportunity to even imagine trying to find any sort of reprieve or any type of wiggle room, because my parents were very, very sort of entrenched in their religious beliefs. I mean, my parents were staunch Adventists, which I write about in my book as well. And I found that there were multiple layers of being silenced, because there were no conversations outside a child needing to bend to what their parents expect, but more so because I was a child that had been born pre-wedlock. Now, the biblical and theological normative would then brand me as an abomination. So there was that layer to unpack as well. So I had to really toe the line. And for the most part, I ended up existing in silos in my head. So my experiences of my parents and being parented then as a child who was evolving and developing were quite brutal, were quite isolating. I felt very much that I had to exist in silos in my head. I had to please my parents a lot so that they couldn't look beyond what I had to perform for them, that they wouldn't notice that, like I was starting to feel there was something sort of untoward or, out of the norm about this particular child, which was the language that was used at the time, which is still being used in some spaces. So I had to perform based on what they dictated and they narrated to me at the time. Even as I evolved, I started realizing that, getting into puberty, I couldn't talk to them about that because it was very confusing for me. But more than that, there was no pocket of safety on the home level to talk about the fact that my body is developing. And this is what it's coming with right now. Very, very much silenced, even evolving when I got into my teen years and I started developing sort of emotionally and finding others attractive. I found myself attracting other pinks or being attracted to other pinks, which was another layer of a no-go area, because not only did we not speak about romantic attraction on the home level, but the fact that I would now be trying to negotiate access to talk about having been branded a pink that is now attracted to other pinks, I realized early on that this is probably another layer of being known as an abomination as a young person. And more than that, at the time, I mean, we are looking at the early 90s where there's a lot of noise, a lot of violence, discrimination, hatred towards gay people, lesbians, homosexuality was still pathologized, I think, at the time. Or maybe it had been depathologized, but the practices towards or the behaviors towards were still very much a pathology. So it was a no-go area. I couldn't speak about it. And so I had very brutal, unsafe, unkind, and very much detached experiences of being parented as a young person, which is why I think at some point I actually shut all of those parts of me down. I could not allow myself to marry myself to who I was becoming. Firstly, I didn't have a language for it. And secondly, I felt that it would be easier to perform what needed performance so that I could get to a point in my life where I left my parents, which was the plan anyway. And that's when I left to come to the UCT in 2000 to pursue my undergraduate studies, which were all over the place. I mean, I started in the Faculty of Law because I didn't know what I wanted to do, and eventually graduated undergrad in commerce. And during that period, I found myself in a very sort of diverse community. So no longer was I now needing to perform for the biblical and theological normative that was the foundation of the nuclear families that I had come from. I was now free from those shackles, but I was still struggling to find the words to sort of assert myself in terms of who I was becoming, and also to find alignment with the feelings that were emerging in terms of who I was evolving to become. And that's when I actually started going to therapy, and I met a therapist who you know, I always say Birgit and I were a good fit from the start. And we just happened to be a good fit. We were a great fit for a couple of years. And even then, I struggled because I knew that university was a part of my life. I still had to go back home, and I would still need to go back into performing for my parents, who were very unwavering about the way that they parented me. And so I buckled under that pressure. I became very, very suicidal, very depressed. I sank deeper and deeper into a hole, started abusing substance. I drank a lot. I then, you know, got into a very, very dark hole, attempted suicide, was eventually booked off for about 6 months from the UCT, had to go for specific interventions. I was admitted into a wellness clinic, a psychiatric clinic in Kenilworth. And I spent about 2 or 3 weeks there. And then from there, I was able to travel back home to the home that I preferred, which was my grandparents' home, Tata, and my maternal aunt who had raised me. And getting back into that space as this broken, depressed, you know, lost young person, I found an opportunity to start healing, but I had to approach this healing in layers as well. And I think at that point, my grandparents were older. And so the primary intervention or base of support from their side was to tend to my wounds, to the broken child in me who had endured so much pain and trauma at the hands of their parents. But we still could not cross that sort of the cross into the conversations about how I was evolving in terms of my sexual attractions. But more than that, the fact that I felt I was not aligned in terms of my evolving identity and the natal part of who I am or was at the time. And so with the help of Birgit at the time, we started approaching my healing a step at a time. And eventually I was able to tell Birgit that this is how I feel, this is who I feel I am. And we did that. We tried to find resources, but we took it a phase of healing at a time. So I think as an intersectional young person identity, like we all are, we carry multiple complexities. I had to find clear pockets of each identity at that time so that I could come full circle in those that needed specific healing before I embarked on, you know, this journey of becoming myself in the absence of language, in the absence of resources or access to tools, to spaces that would probably help me to find alignment with myself. And so it was only in 2007 where I found the tools, the language, and I actually made an intentional decision to start working first, to graduate, find a job, because then I could own my lived reality better if I was self-sufficient. That's how I rationalized it. And I went on to Google and I Googled, what does it mean to know or to be a man, but you're born in a woman's body? And that was the language I had at the time, you know? And so I found then the word transgender, and I found organizations like the Triangle Project. And for the first time in my life, it felt like, you know, a light bulb moment. I went and I made an appointment. And having made that appointment, I spoke to a sexologist, Ronald. We're still very good friends. And from there, I got referred to the trans clinic at Grootersdorp Hospital. And I mean, at the time, I had great friends. I had good friends. I was back at UCT. I mean, I'd already graduated from UCT, but I was living in Cape Town full time. I had good friends who, for the most part, have had to parent me in some or other way. And in those spaces, in those friendship spaces, and later on with some of my maternal family who shifted space without me needing to ask them to shift space, for me to assert myself, I found that there was a willingness to allow Landa to just assert himself as he is, and we will figure it out with him. And so that's when my journey towards my becoming him officially began in November 2009, when I got my first testosterone shot at the transgender clinic at Pretoria Hospital. And at this time, my parents had died. And even before they died, I actually forgot them about them at some point. I was over them. I wasn't interested. I was living my life, and I was going to figure myself out, because I think I'd broken free from the clutches of these normatives and these dogmas that I was born into, and I was socialized according to. And so I found liberties in just finding ways to journey with myself. And so I've lived in Cape Town. I've really sort of evolved. I've tried to find a language that speaks to me as an individual. I've tried to make sense of my journey for myself. I've always asserted or sort of been very clear about the fact that my journey is in no way a blueprint or a guideline for how a blueprint of how it looks like to be trans or gender diverse, because no two human beings are the same or are going to experience life the same. I had to really negotiate to get access to the healthcare resources to get my gender affirming or gender alignment surgeries, which I did in 2014 for the most part. And moving back into my family spaces and my maternal family for the most part, I have had a lighter, more liberal and more freeing experience of being parented by an extended family, which I feel also marries the narrative that I've always heard about the African narrative of it takes a village to raise a child. In my sense, that village really showed up in my sort of adult years. I have never had to unpack myself for my community back home in Mthatha, which is very much entrenched in that dogmatic view of life, very much traditional in their norms and practices of manhood and how that ought to be performed, the rites of passage. I have never had to unpack myself. I have found that members of my family and my community have negotiated access for me into certain spaces, and I've really appreciated that. And I've also used that opportunity to kind of reimagine and plant seeds in terms of how we can reconfigure and rethink the way that we create our communities or construct the narratives that become the norms, the practices, the conventions that we socialize young people based on. As a person who has flirted with the idea of becoming a parent, I myself have battled with a lot of internalized stigma, because there's a clear narrative of what a nuclear family or a family should look like. And for the most part, it is still rooted in the nuclear structure of a father and a mother who are a blue and a pink coming together to procreate and have this child. Even where they cannot procreate, they are the preferred hosts for young people who are in need of parents who are wanting to adopt children. So I have thought about it a lot. I have dated women who have children, who have sort of introduced me to their children, and who have encouraged me to play an active sort of role in parenting the children. I have also toyed with the idea of perhaps parenting is not for me, given the complexities that, I myself have had to navigate, that I still carry as an intersectional identity, not wanting to perhaps to layer a young person with added sort of complexities based on my lived experience. But also I have rationalized the fact that there is no one way of being a parent. And for me, I think the ideal is to, if I do choose to become a parent, to be an enabler of a safe space, a healthy space, where a young child will be able to assert themselves and grow and emerge with their own voice, with their own agency and autonomy, without needing to heal from me and the impositions I will place on them of how they ought to be, how they ought to look, how they ought to function, how they ought to interact with other people. So I'm still in that phase. At the ripe age of 42, I'm still trying to navigate and sort of think about whether or not parenting is something that I would like to delve into, whether or not I do have the, the tools, the capacity, the emotional bandwidth, and the responsibility that would be required of me to become a parent. And I do think that it is something that I do not take lightly. And I think that the way that I'm choosing to approach it is actually, progressive enough to lead me to a better informed decision should the time to do that arise. But so I think that's where I'll leave things. I think I've got a lot of time left over, so kudos to me. So that then leaves us with more time to have an engaged discussion and to chat about whatever thoughts, sentiments, questions come out from the session. And yeah, back to you, Naledi. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I feel like I was in a therapy session, and then I felt like I was in a community, one of the gender affirming care sessions in East London. I felt like I went through such an experience, and I definitely hope that I'm not speaking just for myself. Thank you for such an intimate account and fleshing out a lot of what Madeline was sort of touched on to set the tone for the conversation. We really appreciate it. I'm just going to be very honest with our participants that we are struggling with the Q&A, and we're struggling with the Q&A and the chat box function. However, I think I'm going to try and do this. If you can email me, we've got enough time. We've got about 20 minutes. I think I'll be able to volley between the emails. My email is naledi.mpanza, so my name dot surname at up.ac.za. We'll try to get through as many that we can before 15:15, but I do have a few questions. I'll say it again, naledi.mpanza, which is the name that you're seeing underneath my face, at up.ac.za. So if you send those through, while I'm asking a few questions to Landa and Madeline, I'll definitely then reach into my inbox and share some of these. I think for me, when I've used my power a little bit, and we spoke about privilege and intersectionalities, but that's what comes with this role. As you were both speaking, I was making these connections because I think from even how you sort of set the tone with the illustrations and the different personalities, I think it was so important for you, Madeline, especially to give us, I guess, the biomedical approach, the medicinal version, right? Because I think sometimes in the trivializing of identities, people like to say, oh no, it's a you problem. This has nothing to do with how we understand the human condition, the human body. So I think that really, set the tone, it weighted us really well. I noted that you spoke about institutions, the both of you, in your conversations. You spoke about the family, you spoke about the church, you spoke about schools, you spoke about smoothing the path for your child. And I think, Landa, you also sort of frustrated a bit of that. And I like that. It's not to say, Madeline, you said something that's not real, but I think you then really brought to life the intersectionality of the conversation, how a similar theme or topic or conversation can have so many layers to it, right? And I think what I've always appreciated about you, Landa, is even when you meet you in person, you're very honest that you're not creating a blueprint for how life could be for everybody. You're very aware and intentional, and it's something you also communicate. I've heard, I'm still to read your book. In your book, that these were your layers. This was your intersectionality. You're still finding the language, your age, your family, growing up with your grandparents, your parents, the schooling you had, the privileges that you had access to, right? And I'm hoping this is okay as well, being a trans man and the reality of a trans woman being completely different. So I think, and I really hope that we do get to engage with your book. That's our homework, all 27 attendees, is to really engage with that and to do it with the mindset that, one, this does not speak to every lived reality out there, but the best that we can do is really exactly what Madeline was saying. One, really engage and really also seek out these narratives that help us go against the cis heteronormative society that we've come into being. So I'm going to also now pose some of these questions that I got from the privilege to have my number and access to me. One of the questions was from Dr. Justice Medzani, who's one of the organizers. It's all about power here. Sorry, it's while we wait for everyone else's questions to come through. And Justice was saying, thank you so much. Apologies if this sounds personal, but based on your experiences as a parent yourself, what would you say entails parenting queer children? What form of support, if any, do parents of queer family members require themselves? And that's something that stood out for me, because I'm not going to lie, you're doing the most. You're doing a lot and you're reaching out. And that's not to say that everyone else is doing less. So we do acknowledge that, but also what support do you also require? And what are some of the resources that you need as a parent in order to see you through this process? So while you're trying to answer that, I'll be sharpening my question for Linda as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So I think as a parent, I didn't expect the things to be hard that was going to be hard, if you know what I mean. So your kids come out, and because I've been within that area, we knew from the beginning, affirmation was always obvious. We loved our kids and we affirmed our kids, and we celebrated our children. And I think I got caught off guard by exactly how strange the world is. And you find that you can't tell who's going to be your allies and who's going to be with you and who's not going to be with you. So you suddenly find your community is smaller. You'd go to a braai with people that various acquaintances, and you suddenly find yourself embroiled in a conversation with somebody who suddenly tries to explain to you that homosexuality is a sin, and you suddenly go, okay, these are not my people. And parents that hint, or people that hint that maybe you've done something wrong, or treat it as if it's a disaster that your children are queer, and all of that is very hard as a parent, as a person who both my husband and I had done a lot of thinking of how can we best support our children, and negotiating with schools and figuring out all the stuff that needs to be figured out in the world we live in today. And what I found the most needed was for myself to be affirmed as a parent, for somebody to say to me, you're a great parent and your kids are extraordinary and what you're doing is great. And that didn't come immediately. And I found it in two places. So firstly, was actually through getting involved in the medical community. Prof. Alma de Vries, I'm going to name her by person because she's extraordinary, one of the superheroes in this country. We actually know each other through RUDASA, the Rural Doctors Association of South Africa. So I've actually known Alma for many years, but we've never really, through this process, I got Alma to come and teach, and Alma became a mentor and a friend, and became somebody that's actually now a very important person in my life, of somebody that affirms us as a family. And so through that, especially through Path SA and through Sasha as well, suddenly developing a community of professionals, medical people around me that affirms what we do and affirms the pathway and affirms the things that we have also learned. And then secondly, these parent WhatsApp groups. So I've both attended some of the online sessions run by Jonathan and Melinda in Johannesburg, and I'm on this WhatsApp group that Chris has been running. And just finding other families, and we all struggle with the same stuff. As I said at the beginning, it seems to be prejudice is our biggest enemy. So within the world that there is still too much prejudice, I don't even think it's a huge amount of prejudice. It's just negativity is so poisonous, it just takes a little bit to ruin a whole day. And so the more you feel you have this community of people that care about you and that just affirms, just goes, good job. I think that's been the most important thing. And then through that, those are the people you can ask advice and questions. There's always all those resources that are useful, but I think that community has been the most important thing. And I think this is something that the queer community does really well, is actually building communities and building chosen families and finding communities that cuts across all kinds of boundaries, both geographical and location. And we do that and I think that's why I think as a community, we actually are showing the world where we need to go as society as large. So thank you. Question close to my heart.
Thank you so much. There will be another one just now, but I thank you so much for that, Madeline. It's really hard, Uma. I don't think we get enough spaces where we can unpack with parents, because I know that I've heard about these WhatsApp groups. They're very cool, and I love that they exist. Could never be like, put me in just so I can be part of the cool people. But it's really great when you share that. That's one of the sort of spaces that creates, environment for you to be affirmed while you're trying to also affirm your children. So thank you for sharing on that. Landa, I think as you were speaking as well, something that came to mind was a quote that's going around during Pride around trans health is suicide prevention. And I think in your story just now, you also shared about your health journey, mentally, physically, what the experience was like. Do you mind just weighing in a bit on that? And if you're able to, because you're an intersectionality hun, so please touch on finances and what security and risk and scrutiny means, in the experience of trying to deal with yourself, as the personal is political. And I think one thing that we encounter when we're hearing these very negative, abusive narratives in society is the scrutiny that members of the LGBTQI+ community have, where everyone wants to know about, but they don't want to learn and understand, the lived realities of queer, I'm going to use queer as an umbrella term, if that's okay. Please.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that question. Very important question. And I think that's part of the reason why I do the research that I do, located at universities, which is still university public health facilities, which is still a privileged community, but it's an entry into a big community of young people who are able to access comprehensive, or what should be comprehensive, sexual health at a primary healthcare level. There's a fixation on people's genitals, how they function or how they ought to function, how they should look, and how those are the marker for what should be known as a man and as a woman, which really not only erases a big community of people who are intersex, but also reduces human beings to just one element of who they are. I think people who find and strive towards aligning themselves with who they are, though they may experience intense, and this is what happened to me, though they may experience intense gender dysphoria, which speaks to the natal, the biological characteristics for the most part, a bigger part is having access to healthcare interventions which are going to align your holistic self. So it's not just the natal sex, it's the psychosocial part of who you are. It's your emotional self. It's finding room to grow and breathe and become who you are. And now in a country that has got great a great constitution, great laws that don't discriminate. Nobody can discriminate. Everybody should have access to health interventions that are going to be beneficial to their holistic health. It's very interesting that there's such a small amount or a small budget allocated to actually ensuring that for trans and gender diverse human beings. Nobody should be reduced to having to live in silos in their head because they fear asserting themselves as autonomous and human beings with agency. We shouldn't have to be reduced to living in silos in our heads because we do not have access to required healthcare interventions. And like you say, access is the difference between suicide and healthy living. It's being seen and heard, not accepted, but respected as a fully functional human being who has a right to a full lived experience, who has a right to a full experience of life, who has a right to access resources and interventions that are part of their holistic health. So my research really looks at gender affirming healthcare at a primary healthcare level. So it's primary healthcare delivered gender affirming healthcare, which is not necessarily the surgical part of things, but the basic counseling. Primary healthcare, you must have access to basic counseling. You must have access to comprehensive sexual health. So for trans and gender diverse people who need access to sex hormones, that's part of primary gender affirming healthcare. It's not rocket science. It doesn't require people to be quoting scriptures left, right, and center, or to be asserting themselves as the voices of supreme beings who created everyone. No, your creator is not the same as my creator. We need to learn to respect people, and we need to understand that for one person, primary health care or comprehensive sexual health may be maybe contraceptives, maybe condoms for someone else. For someone like me, that's testosterone, that's sex hormones, which are very beneficial to my holistic health as a person. So yeah, let's leave it at that. I hope I've answered your question. If I haven't, you need to call me.
Yeah, and added extra spices for a nice supper for all of us. Thank you so much. I think your friend actually messaged me. Let me see if you can tell who this friend is. Maybe I've got the wrong friend. But I've got another question. And they were saying that, I'm not sure if I think it's more for Madeline, but please weigh in because you'll hear from the question. Do you feel parents should more consciously raise children in a more gender neutral way? It's a biggie. What would this look like? And how would such parents navigate a gender binary world, which would try to reimpose gendered expectations on their children? And I think maybe Madeline, you can take it while Landa's also speaking. Sorry, our manager is also Landi. Sorry about the slip. And then while you're just sharing, Madeline, if you don't mind, can you both please think as we wrap up about what call can we put out for the higher education space? Because we're both active in the higher education space as researchers, as academics, as professionals, as scholars. And I think I'm really hoping you could share a call, because primarily our audience is in the higher education space, which is a privileged space, and therefore with privilege comes great power and responsibility. So as we just touching base on Landa's friend's question, please could you just also share with us what you think the higher education space could do to really create the reform that you basically mentioned as you were presenting today? Thank you.
Yeah, parenting is always a big topic. And I think people always want to know the nuts and bolts. How do you do this? How do you do that? When we were raising our kids, I think we've got quite a love for the Waldorf education, which is very much in terms of toys, quite non-binary in terms of the toys you make available. But we didn't bring a specific gender neutral consciousness to the raising of our kids, but we created a very open space, I would like to think. But we certainly didn't give it much thought of am I bringing too much binary into this? For me, what's important with parenting, because I think it's also the challenge when you're now a parent whose child has come out and you look back at what you did when they were little. And I think the important thing with parenting is not the details. So quite often we sweat the details of what you do or what you say. For me, good parenting is parenting out of a balcony view. So if you're a parent who creates safety for your children, safety physically, safety emotionally, and safety for freedom of expression. So you're willing to take whoever your child comes and you are open to, we're obviously very much against any physical harm to the child. The child must never feel unsafe with you. A child must feel unconditionally loved, and a child must feel free to go wherever they need to with their own freedom of expression. If you bring that as a parent, the rest is just details. Where parenting becomes dangerous is if you are parenting from a fear point of view. So the kind of parents who are on a dragon level and get nervous about their boy wanting to play with the dolls and then tries to control the environment, that's where the nonsense comes in. So if you're a parent who your child wanted a Barbie and you bought your child Barbies, if you are coming from a loving, open, accepting part of your child and you're willing to go where the child takes you from that point of view, I don't think you can go wrong. As soon as you parent from a dragon point of view and you get critical and you're trying to control and you're trying to and you don't affirm your child for who they are, and your child ends up feeling unsafe, that's where we see the real challenges arise in terms of development. So the one thing I've learned in parenting is don't sweat the details. And you can be an authoritative parent, or you can be a permissive parent, you can be a crazy liberal hippie parent, you can be a very conservative Muslim parent. If you are coming from a balcony view, your children will thrive, and you'll be able to meet them where they are. Do you want me to do the wrap up bit now, or shall we let Landa come in? You want me to wrap up? Oh, and educational spaces, right. So I obviously train medical students. I'm going to be doing my master's, and particularly looking at working with students. But actually, we have had this particular conversation with Landa. So it's partly for me about obviously putting it into medical curriculum. So that's the first thing that we're busy doing. I was talking earlier about the fact that we are going to introduce it as a module into family medicine, both in undergraduate and postgraduate medical education. But I'm of course interested in being able to bring sexual health education, not just around gender and sexual orientation, but sex education in general, because the schools unfortunately are useless at the moment, to bring those conversations and spaces into universities. So I would love, for example, and I'm not completely up to date, I know Vusu's been getting involved in that space a little bit, but for example, having GSAs, gender and sexuality alliances at universities. So having community-based organizations that's open to anybody who wants to build inclusive communities, and where one has conversations like this about gender and sexuality and sex in general, and toxic masculinity, and all of the dynamics around the binary and the heteronormative things that come through, and also how we balance all of it. Yeah, so I would love those kinds of things. So having clubs even at the varsities, and then having people like Landa coming to talk to our club in Mthatha. So, and I think just creating a space for students to engage. So obviously it needs to come into our occupational health at varsities with access to PrEP and access to sensitive. And then the larger question when you're talking to management, which is, I think that's a little bit further down the line, I think we need to start with creating safe spaces among students. But on a longer run, to be able to create for all institutions to start thinking around getting a bit more sensitive about spaces. So hostels is a big issue in terms of male and female dormitories and how you navigate those spaces. Toilet spaces and bathrooms can become challenges. And that's in all of our institutions. And there's a great section in the Gender Affirming Healthcare Guidelines, specifically for institutions, on thinking around those things. So how we start navigating those and doing workshops, it's all about education and creating workshops and conversation spaces. But yeah, I know the top level is always slower. I think with the students, that's something that can start quicker. And setting up some GSAs might be a really nice way to start. So yes, that's my last 2 cents from me. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, and being able to meet up with Landa was really great. And it's been lovely to be part of this process.
Thank you so much, Madeline. Without too much ado, and last but not least, Landa, please could you weigh in?
Yeah, thanks, Naledi. I will take a guess and say that was Pierre's question. I think for me that when we're talking about parents, and like my experiences of having been parented, as I had sort of taken everyone through earlier on, I think a big part of it is for parents to recognize and to be reflexive in how they parent, and recognize that their kids are not their legacy. Their kids are their own legacy, just like the parents are their own legacy. I think in most experiences, well, a lot of experiences, I can't speak for anyone else but myself, but in engaging with different people, different age groups, there has been this pressure that comes from the moment of birth with these social constructions, with these norms, with these values, with these practices, that there has to be a sort of a continuation of legacies from one generation to the next. It clips children's wings. It dims a child's light to have to enter into a script that they may or may not find a home in. So I think that's the first thing. And secondly, I think in raising gender neutral children, you cut out a lot of administration, honestly, because you don't box kids. I was talking at WUSU last week, and we were talking about pronouns. That in some spaces there's this big pushback about people using their pronouns in their email signature when they introduce themselves, and we take it back into a decolonial sort of African sort of agenda, and we actually realize that our pronouns are more they, them than we realize. For an example, in isiXhosa, I don't know the word for he or she, but I know the word for they or them. And when I will greet Naledi, I will sometimes say, Molweni Naledi, which is an all-encompassing, because I don't just view you as your natal being. So I think parents need to remember that. Eventually, despite the pushback that is happening right now, and it's always the big forces, the big power, the leading countries that seem to toy around with vulnerable populations at any point in time when they are pushing whatever agenda needs to be pushed. Eventually, the momentum will get to a point where we don't sweat so much about having these clear sort of distinctions between human beings. We are moving back into a space where we are actually finding that it's easier and it's more realistic to allow children to assert themselves. So I think that's the thing. It's like Dr. Miller says, it's not rocket science. It's really, you don't break your back trying to allow a young person to assert themselves in a safe environment. So I would say that. In terms of the higher education space, very critical space, young adults are entering that space, over 1 million in public universities in South Africa annually. That's a big sort of catchment for these young people. So that's a space where if we're going to speak about decolonizing, then we cannot be selective in terms of our amnesia. We need to think about the colonial project, what it came here, what it introduced, and how we can then try and untangle ourselves from some of those shackles. And a big part of those is the cis heteronormative restrictive way of wanting to mash everyone into a homogenous way of being. It shouldn't be like that. And then secondly, we should then look at the structural and systematic issues that these spaces still carry and find ways to start shifting those. It starts with your operations, your forms, having gender neutral language. Do we really need gender markers in most of these spaces? I would argue not. Why do we need markers even in our births and deaths register in the country? So we have gender neutral bathrooms. We come from spaces where bathrooms are gender neutral. I'm not raising my voice, I'm just very passionate about that one. So it's not the first time you're seeing a gender neutral bathroom at a university or in your workspace. No, in your home or your primary dwelling, you were using a gender neutral bathroom all along. So the moment we will remove this fixation and this obsession on genitals, I think we will start to view and appreciate the fullness of a person and the value of not harming a person because we locate them just on their genitals. So I think that's the work that needs to happen. Like Dr. Miller says, we need to have collaborative efforts. We need to bring in different voices that are speaking a language of, diversity and the decentralization of power, how we can use our power and our privilege or how we have had access to create spaces for others and to reimagine, reconfigure the way that we do things, the way we operate. And more research, I think. Research is qualitative research, interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary sort of collaborations. There's a module that I lecture on at UWC. It's amazing. It's Introduction to Sex, Gender and Sexuality. It's a second-year module. It's in the Women and Gender Studies department where I did my honors. At the end of that module, students write a reflective essay. We're actually in the process of publishing a book now based on some of those essays to see how these young people have journeyed with their unconscious biases, their location in the lexicon of sex, gender, and sexuality at any point in time. And so I think those become important, and which is why I chose to bring my sociology into public health, because healthcare access is very important. So we need multidisciplinary scholars who are going to take the work forward, you know. But the long and short is people should just stop wanting to own others. I think Paula Coelho said it best. Everyone seems to have a clear idea of how others ought to live their lives, but none about their own. People are not just their surface anatomy. There's more to humans than that. And if we can start having those conversations on the home level, by the time we get to our universities and other spaces, it's become part of who we are, our humanness, like I say. And I'll leave it there, Naledi. I hope I've answered your question. I think you're muted.
Yes, a COVID proverb. You're muted. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that. I think I relate with the intersectionality, interdisciplinary approach. I'm a sociologist in a law faculty. You know, the kind of perspectives that you get as well really do remind us that, yes, we're in a privileged space, not just being in the university space, but being in South Africa. And I think Madeline touched on it a bit. Our locality and the laws that really support the work that we do may be new, but there's nothing new about parents supporting their children and creating safer spaces and smoothing the path for them to become who they are. You also mentioned that I think when it's the powers that be, it's the institutions that are really pushing agendas to reinforce harmful stereotypes, prejudices, which really do exacerbate the drama that comes with being human. So thank you so much. I think that's basically a wrap. You've called the higher education space to be more conscious about the curricula, to take initiatives to work across disciplines, to also then, I think the reflective essays I put in the surprise face, because I think there's quite a few courses that may be put in around these topics. I don't think we do end up sharing these to show everyone that there's a lot of work being done and there's a lot of people going on different journeys, right? Because the experiences are different. I don't want to take too much of everyone else's time. While I'm just wrapping up, I'd like to ask Dr. Justice Metsani to please do our thank yous. Thank you so much, Madeline. Thank you so much, Landa. I don't think we could have had two better people to interact and bring our final conversation to life. It was so fulfilling, and I'm going to watch this recording again. I will definitely be sharing it wildly. And just one more thing. There is a film called Unexceptional Parent by Carl Collison. And that's how I knew about all these secret WhatsApp groups that was at a launch in Cape Town. And it's a really great reminder of what you both said. There's layers to this. There's drama within the family at times, but much of this could be a lot simpler if we understood, and instead of scrutinizing people and their sexuality and their bodies, because that's not all what makes a person. So thank you from my side, and Justice, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me? Sure, thank you very much. Incredible. Already we have eaten into our time, so I won't say a lot. I won't say much other than to say thank you very much to our presenters today and to the presenters who were with us in the previous sessions. So thank you very much. And we have come to the end of our event series for this year, the 2023 edition. But it's not the end to the conversations itself. The Pretoria-Marburg queer conversations will go on, but the second edition ends here. So before we end the session, I would like to give a big shout out to some individuals and organizations who have contributed to the successful completion of the program. So firstly, I would like to thank the contributors, as I've already said. Dr. Mula and Landa, thank you very much for your presentations and contributions and ideas, as well as our previous contributors. We would also like to thank our media team, Simpiwe, Vicky, and Marty. Thank you very much for making everything and all the communications that were necessary. And would also like to thank Naledi. I think we have all seen her. She has been driving and steering the program quite well. And we really thank you for doing that for us. I would also like to thank the Center for Gender Studies and Feminist Futures for providing the funding to run this series. We say thank you very much. And last but not least, I would like to thank you, our audience. And we know some of you have been religiously following the program and the series since last year when it started. So we would like to thank you very much, and we would like to see you again in our future editions. Thank you very much. We hope to see you again. Bye.